Grand evening. I am Kanye Shobey with AMPAC, Allodium Moorish Paradium, Ante, Colorado. State provincial government in Morocco, i.e. Colorado. Today's subject matter in class 4, we will be going over the 2010 United Nations Rights to Indigenous People. As you know from our past classes, we have went through Black Civil Leader Mortus. We went through the Dred Scott. We went through the 1724 Christian Black Codes, as well as the 1855 case between William Dungy as well as Joseph Spencer. We're going to round it off today in our 4th class, and we're going to talk about the rights to Indigenous people, 2010 Rights to Indigenous People, which was adopted in 2007 and brought to the table of George Bush, but it wasn't signed off until Obama came to office in 2010. What this is going to describe is that letting you know if you are an Aboriginal Indigenous person, your rights have been given back to you, but up under a nationality status. So we're going to get started today with good brother Brendan. He will kick us off in our readings.
The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples was adopted by the General Assembly on Thursday, 13th September 2007. The Declaration is the most comprehensive international instrument on the rights of Indigenous peoples. It establishes a universal framework of minimum standards for the survival, dignity, and well-being of the Indigenous peoples of the world, and it elaborates on existing human rights, standards, and fundamental freedoms as they apply to Indigenous peoples. The Declaration is particularly significant because Indigenous peoples, including Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander peoples, were involved in its drafting.
Reference point, you can find this website here, as you can look up here, human-rights.gov.au/our-work/UN-Indigenous-people-1. This is one of the particular reference points that you can go to find the United Nations Rights of Indigenous People. And when you do find this read, please pull it up on the PDF version. But it is a must read for all. So we're going to start off with the readings here. As you already know, this is talking about nations. It's talking about international. This declaration was passed by Obama in 2010, but remember, it was brought to Bush in 2007. He put it to the side, and then Obama brought it back to effect and signed off on the declaration in 2010 for the rights of Indigenous people. Start off here.
United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the General Assembly. Guided by the purposes and principles of the Charter of the United Nations and good faith in the fulfillment of the obligations assumed by states in accordance with the Charter. Affirming that Indigenous peoples are equal to all other peoples while recognizing the right of all peoples to be different, to consider themselves different, and to be respected as such.
Stop. What are we talking about? We're talking about the United Nations. We're talking about international law. That anywhere in here it says we want to give the rights back to the so-called black people. We want to give rights back to the so-called white people. Absolutely not. We're talking about the United Nations. We're talking about international law. Go ahead.
Affirming also that all peoples contribute to the diversity and richness of civilizations and cultures, which constitute the common heritage of mankind. Affirming further that all doctrines, policies, and practices based on our advocating superiority of peoples or individuals on the basis of national origin or racial, Religious, ethnic, or cultural differences are racist, scientifically false, legally invalid, morally condemnable, and socially unjust.
So at the end of the day, this has nothing to racial, religious, ethnic, has nothing to do with the nationality. They've already stated right here, these things are scientifically false, legally invalid, morally condemnable, and socially unjust. If you don't have a nation, you are legally invalid and socially unjust. Keep reading, good brother.
Reaffirming that indigenous peoples in the exercise of their rights should be free from discrimination of any kind.
Free of discrimination of any kind. Any indigenous individual is free of discrimination of any kind. Is that happening today? No, because we're calling ourselves black.
Concerned that indigenous peoples have suffered from historic injustices as a result of inter alia, their colonization and dispossession of their lands, territories, and resources, thus preventing them from exercising in particular their rights to develop in accordance with their own needs and interests. Recognizing the urgent need to respect and promote the inherent rights of indigenous peoples, which derive from their political, economic, and social structures, and from their cultures, spiritual traditions, histories, and philosophies, especially their rights to their lands, territories, and resources.
We're talking about culture, spiritual traditions. Where did our culture go? Where did our traditions go? Further recognizing the urgent need to respect and promote the rights of indigenous peoples affirmed in treaties, agreements, and other constructive agreements with states. Stop. What's the key word they just mentioned, Brother Brendan?
They dropped treaties.
Oh, but you told me treaties don't mean anything.
They mean
you won't teach us treaties in school. You won't teach the indigenous people treaties in school. But it just stated right here, indigenous people affirmed in treaties. Why wasn't we taught treaties in school? Because treaties are the truth. Treaties are the supreme law of the land. We can't tell these so-called black people who they are. Keep going, my good brother.
Welcoming the fact that indigenous peoples are organizing themselves for political, economic, social, and cultural enhancement in order to bring an end to all forms of discrimination and oppression wherever they occur.
All forms of discrimination and oppression, no matter where you're at. Here on Midgard, no matter where you're at, all forms of discrimination must be mute. Continue on, good brother.
Convinced that control by indigenous peoples over developments affecting them in their lands, territories, and resources will enable them to maintain and strengthen their institutions, thank you, cultures and traditions, and to promote their development in accordance with their aspirations and needs.
Keep going.
Recognizing also that respect for indigenous knowledge, cultures, and traditional practices contributes to sustainable and equitable development and proper management of the environment.
Of the environment, of the land.
Recognizing also the respect...
Emphasizing,
thank you. Emphasizing the contribution of the demilitarization of the lands and territories of indigenous peoples to peace, economic and social progress, and development, understanding, and friendly relations among nations and peoples of the world.
Friendly relations.
Recognizing in particular the right of indigenous families and communities to retain shared responsibility for the upbringing, training, education, and well-being of their children consistent with the rights of the child. Considering that the rights affirmed in treaties agree... They dropped it again. When
you're listening to this video, I want you to see that they keep talking about treaties. Which is the supreme law of the land? You can actually go to Google and put in treaties, and in Google, it's going to say that's the supreme law of the land.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't tell you. I didn't tatty-tell that one. They tatty-tailed on themselves. They love to tell on themselves.
They really do.
That's because they're arrogant. They never thought we would find this information out. Continue on, good brother Annette.
Agreements and constructive agreements between states and indigenous peoples are in some situations matters of international concern, interest, responsibility, and character.
Continue.
Considering also that treaties, agreements, and other constructive agreements and the relationships they represent are the basis for the strengthened partnership between indigenous peoples and states.
Treaties again. Healthy relationship with the treaties and the people of the state.
Mm-hmm.
Because the people is the government. And without people, there is no government.
Mm-hmm.
Continue on.
Acknowledging that the Charter of the United Nations, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, as well as the Vienna Declaration and the Program of Action, affirm the fundamental importance of the right to self-determination of all peoples, by virtue of which they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development.
Treaties again, even talking about the Vienna Declaration. Go and read the Vienna Convention. Continue on.
Bearing in mind that nothing in this declaration may be used to deny any peoples their right of self-determination exercised in conformity with the international law.
What are the Moors talking about? Self-determination. What else are we talking about? State and international law.
Mm-hmm.
State and international law. There should be nothing else that we're talking about. Where is your state provincial government, Moors? So we can get into international law, because we've never been United States citizens and never will be.
Mm-hmm. Convinced that the recognition of the rights of indigenous peoples in this declaration will enhance harmonious and cooperative relations between the state and indigenous peoples, based on principles of justice, democracy, respect for human rights, non-discrimination, and good faith. Encouraging states to comply with and effectively implement all of their obligations as they apply to indigenous peoples under international instruments, in particular those related to human rights, in consultation and cooperation with the peoples concerned.
Stop. We keep talking about human rights. We keep talking about international law. How can you talk about international law when you calling yourself black, African American, nigger, and colored?
Mm-hmm.
You are civilly the mortus. You are chattel property.
Emphasizing that the United States, or the United Nations, has an important and continuing role to play in promoting and protecting the rights of indigenous peoples.
That's why we gotta have the United Nations protections.
Believing that this declaration is a further important step forward for the recognition, promotion, and protection of the rights and freedoms of indigenous peoples, and in the development of relevant activities of the United Nations system in this field. Recognizing and affirming that indigenous individuals are entitled without discrimination to all human rights recognized in international law, and that indigenous peoples possess collective rights which are indispensable for their existence, well-being, and integral development as peoples.
Stop. Once again, we're talking about you can only be recognized in what? International law.
Mm-hmm.
We have to study international law. Our protections will come from the United Nations with a state provincial government. Where's your constitution? Where's your bylaws? Where's your seal? Where's your flag? Where's your elected officials? Where's your inauguration?
Recognizing also that the situation of indigenous peoples varies from region to region and from country to country, and that the significance of national and regional particularities in various historical and cultural backgrounds should be taken into consideration.
It said country to country.
Region to region.
Reference point, Title 28, Section 3002 states United States is a corporation. 2014 Pope letter to Obama states United States is a corporation.
Solemnly proclaims the following United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as a standard of achievement. Indigenous individuals have the rights to life, physical and mental integrity, liberty, and security of person. Number 2, Indigenous peoples have the collective right to live in freedom, peace, and security as distinct peoples and shall not be subjugated to any act of genocide or any other act of violence, including forcible removing children of the group to another group.
No acts of genocide. What is so tough about this? Article 8.
Number 1, Indigenous peoples and individuals have the right not to be subjugated to forced assimilation or destruction of their culture.
Okay.
Number 2, states shall provide effective mechanisms for prevention of and redress for any action which has the aim or effect of depriving them of their integrity as distinct people or of their cultural values or ethnic identities. Any action which has the aim or effect of disposing them of their lands, territories, or resources.
Stop. We're talking about their lands. Disposing them of their lands.
Mm-hmm.
This is their land. This is our land. Continue on.
Territories or resources. Any form of forced population transfer which has the aim or effect of violating or undermining any of their rights. Any form of forced assimilation or integration.
Integration.
Any form of propaganda designed to promote or incite racial or ethnic discrimination directed against them.
It's all illegal. It's all fraud.
Mm-hmm.
These are not things that they should be doing.
Very true.
This was signed off by their president of the United States of America.
Mm-hmm.
On the rights of indigenous people.
Yep. Article 9.
Article 9.
Indigenous peoples and individuals have the right to belong to an indigenous community or nation in accordance with the traditions and customs of the community or nation concerned. No discrimination of any kind may arise from the exercise of such a right.
No discrimination. Article 10.
Indigenous peoples shall not be forcibly removed from their lands or territories. No relocation shall take place without the free, prior, and informed consent of the indigenous peoples concerned and after agreement on just and fair compensation and, where possible, with the option of return.
Stop. It already said right here, we cannot be removed from our land. Mm-hmm. And they keep saying, your land, our land. They keep telling you that this is your what?
Land.
That this is your land. Mm-hmm. You cannot be removed. So, if they didn't like us so bad, why don't they send us back home? They can't, because we're already here.
Yep.
So what they did is that they created concentration camps,
mm-hmm.
i.e. jails, i.e. inner cities. Oh, no, we ain't removing you. But we also going to put our foot on your neck.
Mm-hmm.
Make sense?
Yep.
Okay. Article 11.
Number 1. Indigenous peoples have the right to practice and revitalize their cultural traditions and customs. This includes the right to maintain, protect, and develop the past, present, and future manifestations of their cultures, such as archaeological and historical sites, artifacts, designs, ceremonies, technologies, and visual and performing arts and literature.
At any particular time, we can go back, past or present, claim our nationalities, and get back to our cultures again.
Yep.
2.
State shall provide the redress through effective mechanisms which may include restitution, developed in conjunction with indigenous peoples, with respect to their cultural, intellectual, religious, and spiritual property taken without their free, prior, and informed consent or in violation of their laws, traditions, and customs.
So these so-called states are supposed to be providing redress for us. Only thing they're providing is stress, duress, and coercion.
Yep.
Your tax expired, $250. Speeding ticket, $50. Parking ticket, $25, $50. Always about finance for themselves. States are constantly creating finance for themselves. They're not trying to make things better for the indigenous people. Article 2. Article 12, Section 2.
States shall seek to enable the access and or reparation of ceremonial objects and human remains in their possession through fair, transparent, and effective mechanisms developed in conjunction with indigenous peoples concerned.
Article 13.
Number 1. Indigenous peoples have the right to revitalize, use, develop, and transmit to future generations their histories, language, oral traditions, philosophies, writing systems, and literatures, and to designate and retain their own names for communities, places, and persons. Number 2. States shall take effective measures to ensure this right is protected and also to ensure that indigenous peoples can understand and be understood in political, legal, and administrative proceedings where necessary through the provision of interpretation or by other appropriate means.
What they're stating is that you're not supposed to be doing anything without letting the indigenous people know. Everything that you're doing, you have to communicate with the indigenous people of this land. They don't communicate when they go and write legislative bills in the back.
True.
Article 14.
Number 1. Indigenous peoples have the right to establish and control their educational systems and institutions providing education in their own languages in a manner appropriate to their cultural methods of teaching and learning.
Okay, so if we decide to teach our children from home, there's nothing wrong with that.
You got the right to. They stated right there.
But you can't do that up under the auspices of black, because they already know you're silver leader mortuus dead in the eyes of the law. No, that child's got to go to school because you're black. 2.
Indigenous individuals, particularly children, have the right to all levels and forms of education of the state without discrimination.
Without discrimination of any kind.
So
when these so-called, I'm sending my child to this school because it's a better program. Hold on. No. All indigenous people have the right to go to any institution that they want to go to. Go to any school that they want to go to. Now they have the territories. If you go to Denver North, if you live in this area, you have to go to Denver North. Or if you live in that area, you got to go to Denver East. Or if you live in that area, you got to go to George Washington High School. That's not what this says. So we can go wherever we want to go.
Very true.
Continue on.
Number 3. States shall, in conjunction with indigenous peoples, take effective measures in order for indigenous individuals, particularly children, including those living outside their communities, to have access, when possible, to an education in their own culture and provided in their own language.
Okay. Article 15.
Number 1. Indigenous peoples have the right to the dignity and diversity of their cultures, traditions, histories, and aspirations, which shall be appropriately reflected in education and public information. Number 2, states shall take effective measures in consultation and cooperation with the indigenous peoples concerned to combat prejudice, thank you, and eliminate discrimination and to promote tolerance, understanding, and good relations among indigenous peoples and all other segments of society.
How many times have they keep trying to eliminate discrimination? They're saying quit discriminating against these indigenous people.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
And number 16?
Mm-hmm.
Article 16. Number 1, indigenous peoples have the right to establish their own media in their own languages and to have access to all forms of non-indigenous media without discrimination.
We can start BET. Let me tell you that. BET.
Yep.
But they were calling themselves Black Entertainment Television. They even got bought out up under the auspices of Black.
Yep.
So imagine if they would have said Moore's Entertainment Television, MET.
Be a different game.
Different game. Go ahead.
Number 2.
Article 16, Section 2.
States shall take effective measures to ensure the state-owned media duly reflected in indigenous cultural diversity. States, without prejudice to ensuring full freedom of expression, should encourage privately owned media to adequately reflect indigenous cultural diversity. Article 7.
So what they're saying, let's stop there. They're saying that the media is supposed to reflect us in a positive light.
Mm-hmm. BET usually doesn't.
Is the media reflecting our indigenous people in a positive light?
Nope.
They're reflecting us and telling, hey, they ain't got no culture. Let's go put the camera on. Let us show you. They ain't got no culture.
Watch them acting a fool.
Mm-hmm.
Article
17.
Section 1. Indigenous individuals and peoples have the right to enjoy fully all rights established under applicable international and domestic labor law. Section 2. States shall, in consultation and cooperation with indigenous peoples, take specific measures to protect indigenous children from economic exploitation and from performing any work that is likely to be hazardous or to interfere with the child's education or to be harmful to the child's health or physical, mental, spiritual, moral, or social development, taking into account their special vulnerability and the importance of education for their empowerment.
Continue on, good brother. Article 17, Section 3.
Indigenous individuals have the right not to be subjected to any discriminatory conditions of labor and inter alia employment or salary.
Well, salary? How many times did your job get given away to the European that you were more qualified? How many times did they try to reach back and try to find something on your record because they didn't want to give you the job? They're impeding your salary.
Mm-hmm.
They can't have you making more money than them.
Can't.
Article 18.
Indigenous peoples have the right to participate in decision-making in matters which would affect their rights through representatives chosen by themselves in accordance with their own procedures, as well as to maintain and develop their own indigenous decision-making institutions.
Institutions. Indigenous decision-making institutions.
Mm-hmm.
Means we need to start our own institutions.
Yep.
Article 19.
States shall consult and cooperate in good faith with the indigenous peoples concerned through their own representative institutions. Thank you. In order to obtain their free, prior, and informed consent before adopting and implementing legislative or administrative measures that may affect them.
Article 20.
Section 1. Indigenous peoples have the right to maintain and develop their political, economic, and social systems or institutions to be secure in the enjoyment of their own means of subsistence and development.
Subsistence and development.
And to engage freely in all their traditional and other economic activities.
Engage freely. How easy is this what we're reading?
It's easy. That's for sure.
It's here.
Mm-hmm.
You've been given back your land.
Tells you right there.
If you have a nation, if you have a state, provincial government, it's right here for you.
Yes, it is.
But without a state provincial government, without a nationality, what do you have? Big fat zero.
Yep. Exactly.
Article 20, Section 2.
Indigenous peoples deprived of their means of subsistence and development are entitled to just and fair redress.
Don't get any simpler than that. Article 21.
Section 1. Indigenous peoples have the right without discrimination to the improvement of their economic and social conditions, including inter alia in the areas of education, employment, vocational training, and retraining, housing, sanitation, health, and social security. Section 2. States shall take effective measures and, where appropriate, special measures to ensure continuing improvement of their economic and social conditions. Particular attention shall be paid to the rights and special needs of Indigenous elders, women, youth, children, and persons with disabilities.
Wow. Now what's happening now? Our elders can't even get health care.
Mm-hmm.
It says you're supposed to, as an elder, you're supposed to be getting free health care.
Mm-hmm.
You're supposed to be taken care of. I worked for a company for 8.5 years.
Mm-hmm.
They put elders up under stress, duress, and coercion.
Yes, they will.
Was denying our indigenous people health care because they were $5 over. Criminals.
That's a shame.
Criminals.
Article 22, Section 1. Particular attention shall be paid to the rights and special needs of Indigenous elders, women, youth, children, and persons with disabilities in the implementation of this declaration. Section 2. States shall take measures in conjunction with Indigenous peoples to ensure that Indigenous women and children enjoy the full protection and guarantees against all forms of violence and discrimination.
Full protections and guarantees against all forms of violence and discriminations. We're supposed to be having full protections, not only with the declaration, but what else? The treaties. The treaties are protecting us. Article 23.
Indigenous peoples have the right to determine and develop priorities and strategies for exercising their right to development. In particular, Indigenous peoples have the right to be actively involved in developing and determining health, housing, and other economic and social programs affecting them, and as far as possible, to administer such programs through their own institutions.
Article 24.
Section 1. Indigenous peoples have the right to their traditional medicines and to maintain their health practices, including the conservation of their vital medicinal plants, animals, and minerals. Indigenous individuals also have the right to access without any discrimination to all social and health services.
Stop. Vital medicinal plants. You know what that is?
It's quite a bit of things. I hate
this. This is called so-called weed.
Yep.
This is called the so-called weed.
Mm-hmm.
But you ain't got no protections for your vital medicinal plants up under black.
True. Section 2. Indigenous individuals have an equal right to the enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health. States shall take the necessary steps with a view to achieving progressively the full realization
of this right. States shall take the necessary steps to achieving progressively. Article 25.
Indigenous peoples have the right to maintain and strengthen their distinctive spiritual relationship with their traditionally owned or otherwise occupied and used lands, territories, waters, and coastal seas, and other resources, and to uphold the responsibilities to future generations in this regard.
It just told you, these are your lands, these are your territories, these are your waters, and these are your coastal seas, amity and maritime.
There it is.
We rule the air, the land, and the sea. Article 26.
Section 1. Indigenous peoples have the right to the lands, territories, and resources which they have traditionally owned, occupied, or otherwise used or acquired.
It's telling you you own it right there.
Yeah.
It's telling you that you are the landlord.
Yeah.
You're not the tenant.
Mm-hmm.
Article 2.
Indigenous peoples have the right to own, use, develop, and control the lands, territories, and resources that they possess by reason of traditional ownership or other traditional occupation or use, as well as those which they have otherwise acquired.
Article 3.
States shall give legal recognition and protection to these lands, territories, and resources. Such recognition shall be conducted with due respect to the customs, traditions, and land tenure systems of the indigenous peoples concerned.
Can't do anything without letting the indigenous people know.
Mm-hmm.
Article 27.
States shall establish and implement, in conjunction with indigenous peoples concerned, a fair, independent, impartial, open, and transparent process, giving due recognition to indigenous peoples, laws, traditions, customs, and land tenure systems, to recognize and adjudicate the rights of indigenous peoples pertaining to their lands, territories, and resources, including those which were traditionally owned or otherwise occupied or used. Indigenous peoples shall have the right to participate in this process.
It keeps telling you, pertaining to their what?
Lands.
Pertaining to their, again,
Lands.
pertaining to their,
Lands.
their,
Lands.
you're the landlord, I'm the tenant. You're the landlord, I'm the tenant. 28.
Section 1. Indigenous peoples have the right to redress by means that they can include restitution, or when this is not possible, of a just, fair, and equitable compensation for the lands, territories, and resources which they have traditionally owned or otherwise occupied or used, and which have been confiscated, taken, or occupied, used, or damaged without their free, prior, and informed consent.
So it's letting you know right here in 28 that we did not give consent to you to come and take and confiscate our stuff.
Mm-hmm. That's what it's saying.
28 states which has been confiscated. They just told on you.
Mm-hmm.
The United Nations just told them, said, they stole y'all stuff.
Yep.
Y'all need to wake up.
Mm-hmm.
You didn't give it to them, they stole it. Article 2.
Unless otherwise freely agreed upon by the peoples concerned, compensation shall take the form of lands, territories, and resources equal in quality, size, and legal status, or of monetary compensation or other appropriate redress.
How are you going to compensate us again? How are you going to compensate us again? Through our lands, our territories.
Mm-hmm.
See, this is all about a state. This whole big old fight has been about a state. The colonizers don't want to give back what's ours.
Yep.
There's no honor amongst the thief. They came and stole it. Article 29.
Section 1. Indigenous peoples have the right to the conservation and protection of their environment and the productive capacity of their lands or territories and resources.
Stop. Their what?
Their lands.
Their what?
Lands.
Okay. Continue on.
States shall establish and implement assistance programs for indigenous peoples for such conservation and protection without discrimination.
Protection again.
Without discrimination.
Without discrimination.
Mhm.
Go back and read your treaties. We are protected. They're even protected. We're not supposed to be doing anything to them, and they're not supposed to be doing anything to us.
True.
It's right here again.
Mhm.
This is why when Bush got this in 2007, he said, I don't want none of that. Can you give me something else around here, please? And then Obama came in, blew the dust off and said, oh my, look at this.
Mhm.
Here you go.
Yep.
My brothers and sisters, wake up, please.
Section 2. States shall take effective measures to ensure that no storage or disposal of hazardous material shall take place in the lands or territories of indigenous peoples without their free, prior, and informed consent.
Nothing shall happen without our consent.
Mhm.
I didn't sign off on nothing that they did to me. So why is this happening?
Mhm.
Continue on, good brother.
Section 3. States shall also take effective measures to ensure, as needed, that programs for monitoring, maintaining, and restoring the health of indigenous peoples, as developed and implemented by the peoples affected by such materials, are duly implemented.
Article 30.
Section 1. Military activities shall not take place in the lands or territories of indigenous peoples unless justified by a relevant public interest or otherwise freely agreed with or requested by the indigenous peoples concerned.
So when you see in your, go ahead, Article 2.
States shall undertake effective consultations with the indigenous peoples concerned through appropriate procedures and in particular through their representative institutions prior to using their lands or territories for military activities.
Mm-hmm. Anytime you want to use our land, you must consent with us for your military activities. Article 31.
Section 1. Indigenous peoples have the right to maintain, control, protect, and develop their cultural heritage, traditional knowledge, and traditional cultural expressions, as well as the manifestations of their sciences, technologies, and cultures, including human and genetic resources, seeds, medicines, knowledge of the properties of
fauna and flora.
Thank you. Oral traditions, literatures, designs, sports, and traditional games, and visual and performing arts. They also have the right to maintain, control, protect, and develop their intellectual property over such cultural heritage, traditional knowledge, and traditional cultural expressions.
Section 2.
In conjunction with indigenous peoples, states shall take effective measures to recognize and protect the exercise of these rights.
Every state is supposed to protect us. Every so-called state on our land of Morocco is supposed to be protecting us. But how do we protect ourselves? We protect ourselves by our state provincial governments. We are supposed to have state provincial governments in every so-called state where they at. We're supposed to be having our state provincial governments there. Moors, wake up. 32.
Section 1. Indigenous peoples have the right to determine and develop priorities and strategies for the development or use of their lands or territories and other resources.
Section 2.
States shall consult and cooperate in good faith with the indigenous peoples concerned through their own representative institutions in order to obtain their free and informed consent prior to the approval of any project affecting their lands or territories and other resources, particularly in connection with the development, utilization, or exploitation of mineral, water, or other resources.
Any resource. We're not supposed to be paying water bills, electric bills, none of that. Those are all our resources on our soul.
Yep.
3.
States shall provide effective mechanisms for just and fair redress for any such activities, and appropriate measures shall be taken to mitigate adverse environmental, economic, social, cultural, or spiritual impact.
Article 33.
Section 1. Indigenous peoples have the right to determine their own identity or membership in accordance with their customs and traditions. This does not impair the right of indigenous individuals to obtain citizenship of the states in which they live.
You can be a citizen. It's up to you.
You have the choice.
You have a choice. Self-determination.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just telling you, I'm not one. You never wanted to be one. But if you want to go ahead and be chattel property, go right ahead.
Section 2. Indigenous peoples have the right to determine the structures and to select the membership of their institutions in accordance with their own procedures.
Article 34.
Indigenous peoples have the right to promote, develop, and maintain their institutional structures and their distinctive customs, spirituality, traditions, procedures, practices, and in the cases where they exist, judicial systems or customs, in accordance with the international human rights standards.
International human rights standard. Article 35.
Indigenous peoples have the right to determine the responsibilities of individuals to their community.
Article 36.
Section 1. Indigenous peoples, in particular those divided by international borders, have the right to maintain and develop contacts, relations, and cooperation, including activities for spiritual, cultural, political, economic, and social purposes with their own members as well as other peoples across borders.
There's nothing wrong with any type of religion. It's the administrators that have indoctrinated us and dummied us down and didn't tell us that we were indigenous people and didn't tell us that we were the landlord. But if you want to have your religious and spiritual beliefs, go right ahead. Section 2.
States, in consultation and cooperation with indigenous peoples, shall take effective measures to facilitate the exercise and ensure the implementation of this right.
Article 37.
Section 1. Indigenous peoples have the right to the recognition, observance, and enforcement of treaties, agreements, and other constructive agreements concluded with states or their successors, and to have states honor and respect such treaties, agreements, and other constructive agreements. Section 2. Nothing in this declaration may be interpreted as to diminish or eliminate the rights of indigenous peoples contained in treaties, agreements, and constructive agreements.
Treaties.
Keeps on showing up. Article 38. States in consultation and cooperation with indigenous peoples shall take the appropriate measures, including legislative measures, to achieve the ends of this declaration.
39.
Indigenous peoples have the right to have access to financial and technical assistance from states and through international cooperation for the enjoyment for the rights contained in this declaration.
Assistance and financial assistance. So if you're on financial assistance, that's your right. You don't have to feel bad about it. It's your money, it's your finance anyway. Federal Reserve notes we know are fake, but it's your finance anyway.
Yeah.
We need to get back to the gold, silver, Mexican pesos. That's what we got to get back to. The real. 40.
Indigenous peoples have the right to have access to and prompt decision through just and fair procedures for the resolution of conflicts and disputes with states or other parties, as well as to effective remedies for all infringements of their individual and collective rights. Such a decision shall give due consideration to the customs, traditions, rules, and legal systems of the indigenous peoples concerned and international human rights.
41.
The organs and specialized agencies of the United Nations system and other intergovernmental organizations shall contribute to the full realization of the provisions of this declaration through the mobilization inter alia of financial cooperation and technical assistance. Ways and means of ensuring participation of indigenous peoples on issues affecting them shall be established.
Stop. That's letting you know the United Nations has to help indigenous people. 42.
The United Nations, its bodies, including the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues and specialized agencies, including at the country level and states, shall promote respect for and full application of the provisions of this declaration and follow up the effectiveness of this declaration.
43.
The rights recognized herein constitute the minimum standards for the survival, dignity, and well-being of the indigenous peoples of the world.
44.
All the rights and freedoms recognized herein are equally guaranteed to male and female indigenous individuals.
45.
Nothing in this declaration may be construed as diminishing or extinguishing the rights indigenous peoples have now or may require or may acquire in the future.
Acquire in the future.
More rights to come.
46.
Section 1. Nothing in this declaration may be interpreted as implying for any state, people, group, or person any right to engage in any activity or to perform any act contrary to the Charter of the United Nations or constructed as authorizing or encouraging any action which would dismember or impair totally or in part the territorial integrity or political unity of sovereign and independent states. Section 2. In the exercise of the rights enunciated in the present declaration, human rights and fundamental freedoms of all be respected. The exercise of the rights set forth in this declaration shall be subject only to such limitations as are determined by law and in accordance with international human rights obligations. Any such limitation shall be non-discriminatory and strictly necessary solely for the purpose of securing due recognition and respect for the rights and freedoms of others and for meeting the just and most compelling requirements of democratic society. Section 3. The provisions set forth in this declaration shall be interpreted in accordance with the principles of justice, democracy, respect for human rights, equality, non-discrimination, good governance, and good faith.
Good governance, good faith of a human being, of human rights. When your children read this one day, brother, they're going to be able to understand it. This wasn't rocket science. They just put it on the table and said, let us put together something which everybody can understand. (2010) United Nations Declaration for Indigenous People is a must-read. This was put together to bring you back into your right mindset. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People was given to you to bring you back into your right state of mind. You need a nation. You need a flag. You need a seal. You need a constitution. You need a bylaw. You need a trust. You need elected officials. You need a government. 3 branches of government. You need these things in order to get your what? Your protections.
Exactly.
The reference point to find the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People, you can go to humanrights.gov.au. You can go to humanrights.gov.au. It will bring up the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People. You can PDF it, save it in your file, but the most important thing is to read it and understand what you're reading. And when you think you've understood it, go back and what? Read it again. Once again, I'm Brother Kanye Shobay with AMPAC, Allodium Morse Radio, Ante, Colorado. Class 4, we look forward to Class 5. Peace and love to all my Moors.